Hello, my name is Antonina Shachar, and I'll be presenting my paper on the myth of personal identity, the self as embodied and incomplete. This project arose as a response to the problem of personal identity, which usually goes something like, what makes you the same person you were yesterday, a year ago, 20 years ago? What changes can the self survive? Which ones can it not? Which properties are sufficient and/or necessary for the persistence of the self through time? Essentially, these questions are all asking the same thing. How is our identity maintained through time? Day to day, we don't notice that we change much as people. However, the differences become more pronounced over longer spans of time. Let's call these different points in your life person stages. Over the span of 20 years, most, if not all of your atoms have switched out, and you probably think and feel differently as well. What makes these two person stages identical? The problem of personal identity is further complicated by clever thought experiments that question every knee-jerk answer you might come up with. So let's take a look at some of the most persistent ones. Fission, fusion, survival across time-space gaps, including interruptions and reassemblies. A fission thought experiment can ask you to imagine something like the following. There's a machine capable of replicating a person. You're thrown into the machine, are successfully replicated, and the resulting two people claim to be you. But both cannot be identical to the original. If this sounds too far-fetched, a less radical version of this idea is transplanting each of your brain hemispheres into two new bodies. Which one would your personal identity follow? Now, let's go back to the replication machine. One day, two strangers are thrown in at the same time, and instead of being replicated, are fused into one. Do they both survive this horror? Who is the person that emerges? Once again, a less radical variation is transplanting the brain hemispheres of two people into one body. This isn't that far-fetched if you think about dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. The question is, can multiple selves inhabit one body? Now, let's imagine that you're diagnosed with an incurable disease and in hopes of a future cure are cryogenically frozen for 100 years. Is the person who wakes up still you? What if the person that wakes up no longer has any memories of their previous life and has undergone a complete transformation in personality? One could argue that anesthesia can result in similar states of interruption. Finally, in the far-off future, we discover a planet similar to our own, but too far away to reach within one's lifetime. There's no freezing or hibernation technology, but there's technology that can disassemble your atoms and shoot them through space at the speed of light and reassemble them successfully into the original configuration, allowing you to be teletransported to the new planet. Do you survive this process? What if the technology scans your atomic configuration and assembles you on the target planet using the same kinds of atoms without actually shooting your atoms through space? Does that make a difference? You probably have certain intuitions in response to these thought experiments, as did almost every philosopher ever. Theories of personal identity attempt to meet these intuitions. They fall into the following categories. Psychological theories emphasize the role of mental states in identity continuity. Examples include memory theory, which requires at least one shared experience memory, and psychological continuity theory, which requires a continuity of mental states that cause one another. Body theories emphasize the importance of being the same living organism, also known as animalism. And some emphasize the need for psychological states to be caused either by the same body or by the same brain. The following subject theories don't directly address the issue of identity continuity, but do address the existence of a self or selves, including Searle's conception of the self as a formal limit on rational conscious action, and Strawson's Sesmet theory, which views selves as subjects of experience that are single mental things, which last for a few seconds at a time. What I call eliminative theories include those that think of the self as an illusion, like a gestalt. Hume's theory of the self as a bundle of perceptions, Dennett's theory of the self as a center of narrative gravity, and the idea that the concept of the self arises from first-person grammar as a useful tool of language. Other theories were formed specifically in response to the bothersome thought experiments, including the non-branching theory, which claims that persons X and Y are identical if they are psychologically continuous, and non-branching. And the closest continuer theory, which states that persons X and Y are identical if person Y is the closest continuer of person X. There are also network or relational theories, which claim that the self arises from biological, social, and cultural interactions. And of course, the soul theory, which claims that persons X and Y are identical if they have identical souls. Most of these are in the domain of analytic philosophy and at least partially tackle the aforementioned thought experiments. However, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are many, many theories of self in the continental tradition, as well as sociology, psychology, and neuroscience that don't directly address the problems at hand. The only ones that successfully solve the problem of identity are the ones that dismiss it altogether, mainly the eliminative theories. And if you're like me, you might be unsatisfied going that route because if the self is an illusion, what is it that is experiencing the illusion? Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, before we can proceed, we must first overcome a couple of roadblocks. The first of which are some false dichotomies that just don't seem to want to go away, the most famous of which is the mind-body problem. But in personal identity literature, you can also run into brain-body dichotomies and mind-brain dichotomies. The second roadblock is inconsistent terminology. From the very first slide, you saw that the terms self and personal identity are used interchangeably. Some philosophers take care to differentiate the two, but even when you stick with one term or the other, the definitions are not always consistent. The term self is particularly troublesome because the definitions differ not only across philosophical theories, but also across psychological, sociological, and neuroscientific theories. Let's take a closer look at why mind-body dualism is just so troublesome. I think Descartes' cogito ergo sum does a fantastic job as a starting point. Descartes draws this conclusion in his meditations as part of his argument from doubt to support the claim that the mind is a separate substance from the body. However, there are presuppositions here that should not be taken for granted. First, it presupposes the first-person perspective, the I, as something separate from the rest of the world, and thus requires a background or context from which it is separate. Additionally, while the first-person referential pronoun is detached from context in Western cultures, it is not always so in other languages. In some Eastern languages, first-person pronouns are governed by social factors, reflecting one's place within a social context. It's thus not universally translatable. Descartes also seems to take it for granted that he's using language to structure his arguments and forgets to credit society for its development. The sentence structure itself follows logical if-then construction. So it seems that there's not only a world outside of the self, but also laws of logic. Finally, the verbs think and exist imply temporality, the conviction of which seems to be a leap away from the skepticism that Descartes was applying to his perceptions. Okay, so, quite ironically, cogito ergo sum demonstrates exactly the opposite of what it sets out to achieve, that we are embodied in a world and embedded in society. There's mounting evidence in support of the 4E approach to cognition that cognitive processes can be embodied, meaning that they are partially constituted by bodily processes outside of the brain, embedded, meaning that they depend on processes outside of the body, extended, meaning that they can be partially constituted by extrabodily processes, and enacted, meaning that they can be partially constituted by or dependent upon active engagement in or with an environment. Proponents of 4E suggest that thought is shaped by language and language is shaped by the body. The body's movement through space shape the fundamental thoughts of people from all cultures, but the metaphors built upon these foundations can vary. We can use this approach as a starting point to begin reconstructing our understanding of the self. As living organisms, we undergo ontogenetic processes, building upon previous physiological states. Both physiological continuity and psychological continuity may be handy black box approaches to describe this ontogeny, but the process is inseparable from its environment, which shapes and constrains potential outcomes, and as such is mixed in with our development. Each reflection upon ourselves, who we are, and our relation to the world arises from a cascade of physiological changes stretching back to our beginnings. Our sense of self thus develops over the course of a lifetime, arising from a vague notion of our body as separate from the world, and becomes reinforced through learning, experiences, and choices, all of which lead to a more stable identity. As people grow older, there are fewer degrees of freedom for radical change. Nevertheless, their sense of self continues to develop until death. Precisely due to this continuous potential for change, there has been a shift to view the self as a process. Thought experiments in personal identity make the mistake of trying to equate separate developmental time slices, applying static labels to two moments that build upon each other, and are part of a process whose completion we are not privy to. In practice, our sense of self at any present moment provides a pseudo-identity, the ontogenetic history stretching from the beginning of our lives to that very moment. However, such an identity is largely interpreted in the context of present circumstances and influenced by personal, social, and cultural biases. Thus, there are two concepts that are often conflated: self as identity and self as process. Self as identity is a label, concrete, unchanging, and practical. It is a description that we can reliably invoke to make narrative sense of the world. Self as a process is fluid, dynamic, and complex. Its lack of reliable predictability makes it impractical to invoke when making quick judgments. Self as identity is what we use to refer to others. Self as a process is what we experience. The problems of personal identity arise in part due to the conflation of these two concepts. Personal identity theories attempt to apply numerical identity onto incomplete phenomena. We can think of personal identity as a time slice or a snapshot of a developing self. As such, personal identity is sufficient to determine the existence of a developing self, and a self is necessary to have personal identity. There can be no personal identity without a self to anchor it. However, having a developing self does not necessarily imply consistent personal identity. A self develops until death and is never the same numerically at any 2 points in its development. Here is a visualization to build your intuition about how one sense of self develops over time and how the developmental potential shrinks as the sense of self becomes fortified. If the self is a process, it is only at the point of its completion that it is possible to apply properties of identity. Selves require context and are indivisible from their background world, which shapes their developmental potential both physically and mentally. It is impossible to extract the self from the world, as the world is the content of experience. Furthermore, selves are culturally and historically situated. The culture and time that a self is born into provide scaffolding for the developmental trajectories that the self can follow. At birth, the degrees of freedom for a self's developmental potential are dictated by genetics, environment, and nurture. There's not much to a sense of self at birth as it begins to develop through embodied action. As babies go from imitating without much understanding to acquiring language, a more robust sense of self develops. As the self develops, personal choices begin to factor into future trajectories. As a person grows older, dramatic changes of the self require dramatic experiences or tremendous motivation. Otherwise, the self is reinforced by environment and habits. Self-concepts become ways of interpreting experiences. A self develops until death and is never the same numerically at any 2 points in its development. It is only upon death that personal identity and the self converge. As Heidegger famously put it, death is one's own most possibility, unique to each self. Death allows for the process of the self to become an objective concept to which identity relations can apply. Thus, only in death can two separate moments belong to the same self-identity. I think much of Heidegger's terminology, if I'm understanding it correctly, can be applied to this view of the self. First of all, we're thrown into the world with cultural and social affordances. Not only are we being in the world, but we're also being with it, and there is a bidirectionality between our existence, how we shape the environment, and how the environment shapes us in return. And as we grow, this personal baggage or has-beenness that we accumulate partially constructs our identity, reinforces the present, and limits the future. And I want to emphasize that I'm not referring here to only the psychological, but all of experience. It all accumulates in the present. On the other hand, we are also being toward death, which presents us with countless trajectories which we can try to navigate or just allow to happen to us. Regardless, we are constantly moving forward along with the rest of the world through a collapse of potentials. That's another point I want to emphasize. We're not thrown into a static world. It is constantly changing along with us. That's what the rectangular time slice is supposed to represent. A snapshot of the world as we move along with it. One of the benefits of this view is that it doesn't require psychological continuity. So the person with Alzheimer's continues their self-process, albeit with reduced number of potentialities for the future. Another benefit of this view is that it's compatible with both free will and no free will perspectives. Now, let's see how it stacks up against those troublesome thought experiments. So the myth of personal identity requires identity of person stages. Thought experiments make the mistake of trying to equate separate developmental time slices. However, if the self is a process, its developmental time slices need not be identical. Identity necessitates the ontogenetic continuity of the human organism based on embodiment in the world. While necessary, ontogenetic continuity is not sufficient for personal identity. Identity requires a complete, coherent concept. The self, as a process, is not complete or coherent until its death. Most theories of personal identity cannot satisfactorily answer the problem of fission, which allows a one-to-many relation. If ontogenetic continuity is necessary for personal identity and death is the sufficient condition, then each resulting organism from fission is a separate self, under God's eye view, or subspecie aeternitatis. Please forgive my American pronunciation. Thus, while birth may not be a unique condition for a person, death still is. How can one person be physically and or psychologically continuous with two prior persons? Just as organisms can be created from the fusion of two gametes, or a new tree can grow from the grafting of two separate trees, so too can a new self emerge from the fusion of two prior selves. Subspecie aeternitatis, this process can be seen as two parents producing an offspring. The point of their emerging is both a death and a birth on the line of ontogenetic development. Thought experiments involving teletransporters and comas all appeal to interruptions in time or across space. If ontogenetic continuity is a necessary condition for personal identity, then processes that interrupt this development may result in the death of a person. I think there can be narrow and wide interpretations for this criterion. For instance, teletransporters may result in death, with the potential for a new self to be born in a new context. On the other hand, comas might not result in death, but a shift in the background context upon revival. Here's a selected bibliography of readings that influenced this project. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to reading and answering your questions and comments. Take care.